So I'll just say good afternoon, and in my capacity as a member of the Health Committee, I'd like to welcome you to today's seminar. This afternoon's topic is older persons in care. Our speakers are going to share their thoughts and themes relating to this topic, presenting some of the challenges and opportunities facing our health and social care system, brought about by demographic and social changes experienced not just here but across Europe and beyond. The questions we need to ask are: what type of care provision should be made for our older people? Who will provide that care, and where will it be provided? Do we recognise the role played by carers, volunteers and family? And as someone who's worked for many years in the advice sector, I think carers are a group that are much maligned in a sense and unrecognised, and I would just make that point, and very much underpaid. And do we provide the support and recognition they deserve? Firstly, Dr. Assumpta Ryan of the University of Ulster will present some research findings on family caregiving, older people and long-term care. Her research has identified some key implications for the development of policy to support family carers and health and social care practitioners as they assist older people make the transition to long-term care. Then, Jan Draper, George Kernahan and Anya McNamara from the Open University will discuss the role of the hospice volunteer in community settings. A commissioned literature study has helped to identify the benefits of volunteering to the hospice, patients, carers and the volunteer. Her presentation highlights further work that will fill current gaps in the research and help to promote the practice of volunteering in the community. The final presentation will be delivered by Dr. Kevin Moore of the University of Ulster. His presentation will explore the roles, responsibilities and services provided by home helps and domiciliary care workers in a large health and social care trust. His research highlights the important role of the home care worker and how that role is recognised within the wider health and social care context. So thank you very much for listening and enjoy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming along to the presentation this afternoon. I would like to extend a word of thanks to Eileen Regan and her colleagues at RAISE for inviting us along today. As researchers, a significant part of our work is being in a position to influence policy and practice, and where better to do that than here at Stormont. So thank you very much. Just to give you a little bit of background to myself, I've been interested in the care of older people for a very long time. I've been doing research in that area for over 20 years. And that has sort of taken me to look at issues relating to people, older people in receipt of community care obviously in their own homes, and then to a consideration of the needs and experiences of families providing that care. And then more recently, my interest shifted to how older people and their families manage the very difficult transition to long-term care, especially after they've been providing care for many, many years. So I'm not going to present on a single study, but rather I've sort of tried to collapse 20 years' work into 20 minutes. So that's a minute a year, roughly. And I hope to give you a flavour for the sorts of issues that I've heard time and time again over that period of time. The data for these studies were collected in Northern Ireland, some in the Republic of Ireland. There was an EU study. And I have included some quotations, and I would say that the quotations have been drawn from studies involving participants in Northern Ireland. So that's the first part of the study, an overview of the research, and then the latter part will focus on the policy implications. Virtually all of these studies have been published, and some of you may have a particular interest in a particular study, and I'd be very happy to make those publications available to you or make those conference presentations available to you. So why are we interested in family caregiving and long-term care? Well, everybody in this room, and I've had a look at the delegate list, will be aware of the demographic changes and the increase, particularly in the number of older people across Europe and particularly in Northern Ireland, and the challenges that will provide for us all. Add to that change in family size and structure, the impact of separation and divorce, the impact of migration, the impact of immigration, the changing role of women in society, and I would add to that the changing role of men in society. And throw into the mix then the prevalence of long-term conditions. So we have a lot of older people living much longer, but that longevity isn't necessarily accompanied by an improvement in quality of life, particularly towards the end of life. And those issues will pose very major challenges to families who wish to provide care at home and to older people who want to stay at home. And if you ask older people, where would you like to live for the rest of their lives, they will say to you, I would like to stay at home. And if you ask families, family will say, well, in an ideal world, I would like to be in a position to support my relative to remain at home. But for that to happen, we need an awful lot of support and a very robust support structure. And indeed, the time may come when that is no longer an option. Caregiving is demanding. It is demanding from a physical point of view, from a psychological point of view, from a social point of view, and indeed from a financial point of view. And over the years, I've talked to lots of caregivers and asked them about the aspects of their caring role. And they will talk about the difficulty associated with sleep deprivation from a physical point of view. People caring for a relative with dementia will talk about trying to manage challenging behaviour, trying to cope with antisocial behaviour, trying to manage incontinence. And these are particularly difficult issues for people caring for a relative with dementia. And more recently, I've done some research looking at male caregiving in dementia. And this is the landscape of care. 20 years ago, the literature, your typical care was a middle-aged female. Now we have more young people caring, we have male carers, and we have a change in the dynamic of caregiving within an intellectual disability context. And again, that final quotation, that was a son who was really struggling with issues around the provision of intimate care to his mother. From a psychological perspective, carers experience a whole raft of emotions, and it saddens me to tell you that most of the literature on family caregiving is characterised by fairly negative, or if not less positive findings. And most of my own research would probably endorse that. Now, I suspect that is because the people who volunteer to participate in this type of research are people perhaps who haven't had a good experience and want their voices heard. But certainly it's the frustration, the resentment, the anger, the feeling of being taken for granted. And as evidenced by that final quotation on the presentation, this was a woman, and I can still see her in front of me. She was married, so she was trying to be a good wife. She had a son, she was trying to be a good mother. She was caring for her own mother, so she was trying to be a good daughter. She had one sibling, a brother, who had a child with a disability. She was trying to be a good sister, and she was also trying to hold down a full-time job. And she said to me, I never get it right. That is just an impossible balance. Those conflicting roles, one need is met very often at the expense of the other. From a social point of view, particularly in the latter stages of caring, and particularly somebody may be caring for somebody with dementia or with a very high level of need, where they feel that they almost can't leave that person for very long periods of time. From a social point of view, that begins to exert an impact and manifests itself by feelings of isolation, by feelings of loneliness, a feeling that their lives are restricted. And again, that final quote, that daughter who just missed the choice of being able to decide what she might do on a given day. That wasn't that she missed the activities particularly, she said to me, but she said, I just miss having that choice. And again, looking particularly at caregiving in dementia, I was very struck by the decisions that people who care for a relative with dementia have to make in the context of living with risk. And again, particularly in the advanced stage of the disease, it is about how much risk am I prepared to live with? And very often it's the point where a tipping point is reached and the carer is no longer able to live with that risk. From my own research, I found that men tended to be better at living with risk than females. They tend to cope better with the stresses and strains associated with that. It was difficult for females. And the risks I'm talking about are the risk of fire, the risk of fall. One gentleman told me about his mother who hitched a lift into town with a complete stranger, had a very large sum of money that she wanted to lodge to the bank. So, there comes a point when that risk is just unacceptable. Now, if you look at the literature on the needs of family caregivers, the literature is almost entirely consistent over the years. There's been very little change in research looking at what carers need. And basically, there's the need for information and the need for support. Information about the condition of the person, and that information helps people to better understand how that condition manifests itself. So people who know about dementia, why it's caused, are better able to, if you like, disentangle their relative from that sort of behaviour, which sometimes can be quite difficult. But they also want information on support, and they want information on financial entitlements. In particular, they want information from a one-stop shop. It is terribly frustrating for caregivers to be moved from Billy to Jack and maybe told conflicting information. So they want this information, and their demands of their caregiving role mean that they want it from a one-stop shop. In terms of support, they look for support from family members, and it is a complete and total myth that the larger the family, the more support will be provided to older people. We can just banish that here and now. That is not the case at all. Usually the caregiving responsibility falls to one person. If that person is lucky, there'll be a rota put in place, although I've coined the phrase now, the rota that doesn't rotate, because very often this is the reality of how things. But where family support exists, and where it is good, and where there is an even distribution, not even of the work, but of the responsibility, caregiving can be sustained for longer periods of time. And more significantly is the support provided by health and social care providers. And I cannot emphasise enough how important that support is. Support around the time of engagement with the caregiving role, which tends to be quite a gradual process. People don't sort of decide to become a caregiver. It happens over a period of time. But of equal significance, and I say this in the context of transforming your care and the recommendations therein, support in disengaging from the caregiving role. One piece of research talked about an older lady who was looking after her husband, asking permission from the social worker to move her husband into long-term care. So people look for validation from health and social care professionals. They want to disengage from the decision-making, and George and I had a conversation about this earlier. It's the elephant in the room, long-term care. People don't want to talk about it, families don't want to talk about it, and they look then for validation to health and social care professionals who have a very important role to play. Now, there is no doubt that respite plays a very important role in enabling people to continue caregiving. And the challenge, and this is a challenge, the challenge is to try and meet the needs of the carer, because the carer is usually the person who needs the respite, to meet the needs of the carer, but to try and do so whilst also recognising and taking into consideration the needs of the older person. And sometimes these can be conflicting needs. And you have a situation there where that daughter wanted a holiday in her own home. She didn't want to go anywhere. She didn't want to do anything. She talked about reclaiming her house for 2 weeks. But in order for that to happen, her mum needed to go into a nursing home. Her mum didn't want to go in a nursing home. So how do we square that circle? So for some, it is not a consideration. For others, it is a lifeline. And for others, again, and Deirdre Heenan at the University of Ulster has done very interesting work looking at farming families. And she found that farming families were very resistant to long-term care, that there was an expectation that care would be provided within the family, and any sort of residential care was very heavily stigmatised. So all those things are in the melting pot when we're trying to think about respite. But invariably, for many carers, there comes a time when they're no longer able to continue their caregiving role. So typically that happens when the needs of the older person are increasing, and they will increase. If you look at most of the conditions, respiratory, cardiovascular, dementia, there is characterised by a progression level of need. So the needs of the older person increasing, the ability to meet those needs of the care is decreasing, and again that can be because of burnout or maybe their own in-health or other family commitments or whatever. And then that gap becomes so wide that it's at that point entry to care becomes a consideration. And I have been amazed as I interviewed people over the years, and they told me their story, and coming to the end of the caring at home, and how even though, as they told me the story, it was so obvious to me that care was unsustainable long term, for the people concerned, it was a massive shock. It was a massive body blow once the decision had to be made about long-term care. So perhaps because of that, it is that making that transition from home or community care by the families, to long-term care is a very, very, very difficult transition for families. And if you think about what typically happens, it's usually precipitated by a crisis, not always, but by a crisis or a period of hospitalisation. And then there's a realisation, listen, that you can't continue, this can't continue, there's too much of risk, or the level of care is so great. And then decisions are made about choice of a nursing home. Family probably haven't given it an awful lot of thought. Realistically, some families may have. The choice of home may not be available. They may have to opt to go somewhere else in the meantime. And if you contrast that with our own experiences, and think about the first time you bought a house, the first time you chose your apartment, you wanted the country, I wanted the town, you wanted the minimalist modern look, I wanted the rustic charm. It's a very personal choice. And would you have taken the second house on the list? And would you have taken a house that you never saw? And would you have let a stranger, a social worker, go out and choose your home? Of course you wouldn't. And these places will be their homes. These, in all probability, are the places that these older people will die. So this is a personal bugbear of mine. I feel that as a society, we don't appreciate the magnitude of that decision. We really don't appreciate the magnitude of that decision. And there is a suggestion in the literature that residential care has become stigmatised because of this view that home is where the heart is, and home at the hub, and all of this, and that carers then feel that they should provide care at home, and that is of course reinforced through policy norms, through transforming your care and so on and so forth. And then for carers who can no longer do that, there can be a sense of guilt that maybe they're not doing what they should be, they're not being the good daughter or whatever, and this can cause problems for them in that transition. And it can also make life difficult and relationships difficult for carers, their families, and the nursing home staff. The literature on spousal caregiving is very interesting because, of course, caregivers are not a homogenous group of people. And if you look at the literature on spousal caregiving, there's a lot about how admission to long-term care is not dissimilar to a bereavement, a sense of loss. There's a famous quote in a paper by Mike Nolan, a research participant, said, "It was easier to bury my wife than to place her in a nursing home." So it's a very, very difficult decision. And that sense of loss, that sense of bereavement comes out very, very clearly when talking to these people. And that lady there, she said she was a wife and a widow. She said, "I'm a wife, I'm married in the eyes of the church, in the eyes of the law. My husband is in the nursing home, but he can't speak to me. I go in every day, I eat alone, I socialise alone, I live my life without him." And she said, "I'm a wife and a widow." So I think spousal caregiving brings its own challenges, and these people need a lot of support in the post-placement period. So after the move is made, Woods et al. Would suggest that in a good transition, there are 4 stages. There's the guilt and the loss, the trust, building relationships, and then interesting, spouses will usually, not always, start to build their life around the home and their relative in the home. And then adult children will try and start to develop their own areas of their life and maybe try and ease some of that conflict that they were dealing with earlier on. But this is a very difficult time. This immediate post-placement period is a time when relationships between care home staff can be very, very fraught. Because I have been providing care, for example, to my mother for years and years. I know that when she's blinking like this, it means she wants to go to the toilet. I have all that wealth of biographical information about her. And I am relinquishing everything to strangers. So my level of expectation is going to be way up there. And I'm feeling guilty, so I can only comfort myself if the care that my mother is getting is so much better, not as good as, better than the care that I was providing at home. And I'm manifesting that by maybe asking questions of the staff and wondering has she had this and wondering has she had that. And they're thinking, whoa, this is a problem, this lady is trouble. And it can be very, very difficult. The relationships can be fractured very early in that transition phase. And I've recently got a grant to look at how we can improve that transition. Families want to remain involved in nursing homes, particularly spouses. They see their role as maintaining contact with the older person, maintaining contact with the community. They see that they have a very strong role as an advocate, and we all need an advocate. And particularly spouses will want to be involved in relatives' care. But this can be a tricky one because there is a need to negotiate role boundaries in terms of what the care home staff, the nursing staff, can and should do, and what the family member can and should do. And that just needs a conversation around the table, which very often, I'm afraid to say, doesn't happen. So, how do we ease the transition? We firstly need to recognise the magnitude of it, particularly that decision around entry to long-term care. It is a huge life event. Families need support, the person making the transition needs support, and staff working in care homes need support and advice on how best to manage that. I've just had a paper accepted for a journal, and the title of it is The Importance of the Little Things. And this came about because of the number of people I interviewed over the years and asking them about, what does quality care in a care home mean to them? And they said, well, it's the little things. And I said, what little things? And, oh, well, always, looking well and, having her dentures in and her glasses and her hearing aid and, Dad likes a glass of Guinness, every Friday night and just, and maybe just going out on the farm or whatever. And they kept referring to these little things, the respect for a lifetime routine. And my mother is 86 and she lives by the clock. There is a time for everything. And a lot of older people are like that. They've established a routine over their lives. And care home staff who make an effort to try, and it's not always possible, but an effort to try and get to know the person, and where possible to respect that lifetime routine, that means a huge amount to families. I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said the problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And that is certainly the case. We need more communication between older people and their families. Serious problem, particularly about decisions with respect to long-term care. It really is still the elephant in the room for many, many families. And more information. And better partnership working between families, residents and nursing homes. So from a policy perspective, we know older people want to age in place, and transforming your care as a policy position will, if they're adequately resourced, support people to do that. But I will say this, that I've talked to a number of people who never wanted to go to a nursing home. It wasn't on the table. There was one particular lady and her daughter was at the point of having mental health problems. And the social worker said to her, listen, you have to go because otherwise your daughter is going to be ill. She won't be able to care for you and you're going to have to go anyway. So you need to go now and you need to give her a break. And this lady was at home. She had Parkinson's disease. She had arthritis. She couldn't lift a glass to get herself a drink between the times the carers came in to visit her. She was completely dependent on the home care work, as Kevin is going to talk about later. She moved into the home and she said, I asked her daughter, how did she find it? And the daughter said, you know what she said to me? She said she should have done it years ago. And literally my heart broke because the sacrifices that daughter had made over all that time. And so very often it's the fear of the decision, it's the fear of moving into long-term care. For many people, it is, many people have a sense of safety, a sense of security that they hadn't had at home, but still there will be that resistance to it. I was looking at statistics from the DHS SPS, which very instantly showed that here in Northern Ireland, only 44% of older carers have their needs assessed. compared to 89% of older carers in England. And this is an interesting statistic, because I remember 20 years ago thinking, in my naivety, that if we could have an assessment of carers' needs, and if we could have that enshrined in legislation, then that's it, problem solved, problem sorted. But clearly that is not the case, and there are a number of reasons. I suspect they're spousal caregivers, the duty of care, till death do us part, and sickness. There's a bit of that. There's probably a little bit of concern about, you're snooping into my private life and you might take what I have or whatever. So whatever it is, I don't know, but we certainly need to address it as an issue. Again, look at older people with intellectual disabilities living longer than they've ever lived before, been cared in the main by parents. These are people who would probably not get married, they won't work. They will not have people to support them, perhaps, unless siblings do so, after their mum and dad die. So what we see, and I've just completed some work on this, is the development of a mutually dependent relationship. The people with intellectual learning disabilities very often are providing care to their older mum or dad, who in turn is sort of providing support to them. And again, we need to look at how people can be encouraged to future plan. I know I'm just almost out of time. We need to look at issues about rurality, and caregiving in rural areas is very different to caregiving in urban areas, and the needs of rural carers are different. We absolutely need to support health and social care professionals, to practitioners, not just professionals, anybody working in health and social care, to provide that advocacy role during that transition, and again, the partnership working. And I was thinking about what one message I could leave to you today, and I couldn't think of one, so I thought, well, I'll think of two. So, and this is it. We need never lose sight of the fact that old age needs so little, but needs that little so much. And I see this with my own mother now. She has care coming in the morning, bit of help in the afternoon and in evening time, and we've managed to be quite specific about what happens. So nutrition is met, mobility, and more importantly, her medication is all tied in with the times that care is coming in. And it's not a lot, but it is making a massive difference to her quality of life and her ability to stay at home. But, there's always a but, I couldn't possibly have done this research over the years and listened to carers without issuing this red light warning. And that is that services should not support caregivers beyond the point beyond which their own health suffers. And we need to be very mindful of this in making our decisions about that disengagement. So thank you. Thank you for your attention.